will definitely be of great benefit.
Recording has started.
All right. So hello. Thank you all for coming. My name is Dawson Wainman. I am the Director of Student Life for the Frost Student Association. Co-hosting with me tonight is Adam Folland, the President of the Frost Student Association. And we are joined tonight by Thom Luloff, faculty at Fleming Frost, who's done work in conservation biology in the Fish and Wildlife program. Please take it away, Thom.
Hi, everybody. Thanks very much for inviting me tonight. This is a topic that I'm very passionate about, and it's been, I have to say, like the last couple of years. I mean, when we think back to pre-2020 to now, I mean, so much has changed, and yet, of course, some things have stayed the same. But one of the things that's really come to the forefront for many people is how important nature is and has been, not only in dealing with challenges, but also finding peace and solace in a very unsettling time. So again, I hope that if there's anything that we can pick up from the talk tonight, it's about a call to action around appreciating nature and, of course, doing our own bit to help conservation initiatives. So let's just rewind a little bit, and we'll go back to January 2020, which does feel in many ways like a lifetime ago, because this was before COVID, before we were really sort of aware that all of our lives would take a very significant turn, some for the better and some for the worse, and the pluses and minuses for sure, but definitely a change nevertheless. When we were back in January 2020, we as a human species knew that we had many challenges that were both local, regional, and certainly global. And so some of these challenges were, of course, around human demographic growth and the large and essentially in some ways exponential growth of the human species. And with that, of course, coming the pressure on resources and demands. So again, just to take us into that context, in 1804, for the first time ever, the human species reached a 1 billion person mark. And then 1960, we were 3. And then very recently, we've been adding on billion people. So 1999 to 2011, and projected to hit 8 billion by 2024. And of course, that comes with costs. It comes because, of course, you have more people to feed, you have more people who have houses to look after, people want to live, of course, in certain environments, and that, of course, causes pressure on our global and regional landscapes. So the demand, of course, for food, for timber, for building materials, for concrete, for all of those things that go into making a human life, have increased to the point where we're really close to the edge of our sustainable development, in some cases, of course, over that. And that, of course, has big ramifications and does so even in the impact between things like, of course, our interaction with nature and the potential for spreading zoonotic diseases. So one of the things that we've, of course, seen or are very aware of is the nature of how wildlife, in essence, can interact and essentially transfer disease agents from wild species to humans. And most of course, all of our recent histories, deadly human diseases have come from wildlife. And COVID-19 certainly is likely not an exception to that. Of course, there's still ongoing work to really pinpoint where that came from, but pangolins and bats being fairly, with potentially some, aardvark or armadillo vectors in there are certainly good candidates for that. And of course, as humans, we do know that we do a lot of trade in wildlife parts and wildlife species. In the United States alone, last year, 23 million whole animal parts, samples, products made from bats, primates, and rodents were brought in over a 5-year period. And of course, we know that those species being either mammalian or closely related to us as Homo sapiens do harbor about 75% of known zoonotic viruses. So that's, of course, we know is an issue. As we get closer and closer to wildlife or wildlife refuges, we push closer and closer to the edges and limits. We're forcing more wildlife-human interactions than there ever have been before. And again, we know that there could be consequences to that. Even here in Ontario, we can see the pressure that exists on humans, pushing the boundaries out for what we would call a wild landscape. So if we look here, we see Southern Ontario, Northern Ontario, Eastern Ontario, and we can see that a vast majority of Southern Ontario, where there's good arable soils, of course, have been converted to agricultural. Now there's, of course, pockets of forest, that's true, but by and large, most of that landscape is completely human altered. And we can see in urbanized, which is the red color, we can see, of course, very limited wildlife could live there at all. So the forested areas, so the more wild natural areas are being pushed further and further north. And that again causes more human wildlife encounters than we've experienced before. We also know that biodiversity was declining. So this is just one simple example, but 2.9 billion birds were essentially gone from North America since 1970. So we know that we're seeing, really catastrophic declines in certain keystone species around North America. And that's being driven in part by habitat loss as we see conversion to human other activity. And that, of course, is contributing to these larger scale issues. We, of course, know that climate change has been another one of these major human crises that is affecting us pre-2020. And we know over historical periods that not only is the temperature warming, we have changes in CO2 levels and other metrics for climate change. So again, another challenge that we were experiencing pre-2020. Pollution and contamination certainly have not only become more and more forefront in the human experience. We see images that were really graphic of wildlife, of course, being contaminated, oil spills, you name it. We know that that fills our newsfeed, and we knew and know it is an ongoing problem. As well as introduced species. So again, how many animals, things like cats, feralized cats, domestic cats, we know that they are just one introduced species. There are so many others we could talk about, the country of Australia being a great example of bringing in so many different non-native and introduced species, which caused vast ecological impact. So again, we know that that was an ongoing challenge as well. And probably most importantly, not to denude the other ones, but even within the human species, polarization and inability to not only just get along, it's not even that, but listen and empathize with people who have different points of view was also, and still is, an ongoing challenge. So before things really got, COVID-19 really affecting our human existence, we knew that we had a variety of challenges that were coming at us from all angles as a species being stewards of this earth. And so when we experienced the great anthropause, right, which is a term that's been coined to describe 2020, where the human experience suddenly just changed. It stopped in the sense that we were locked in, we were not doing the things we would normally do, we weren't traveling to the same degree, our whole experience had shifted. That again, these challenges didn't necessarily disappear, but they certainly were looked at in a different context. People were appreciating what things were looking like being pollution-free, for example, in heavily polluted areas that weren't experiencing the same level of contamination during the anthropause. So again, it's not like it's necessarily, we think about this in essence as a good thing or a bad thing, it's just a change. And our perception, of course, may never be the same for those of us that have experienced going through this great anthropause. Some of the things that have come out of this great anthropause over the last year have been positive, and we have to look at both sides. So Earth, for example, the seismic noise, that, of course, has changed, as well as animal sightings in urban areas, really surprised a lot of people in the sense of how much wildlife is living in and around them when we took the time to be able to appreciate what was there. And so we saw that by a number of metrics. This is just an example of one. Using iNaturalist, for example, as well as eBird and various other sort of apps that would essentially assist with nature discovery, saw a tremendous increase in usage and also in terms of sharing of information. iNaturalist posted a 58% jump from the previous year in terms of posts and usage and interaction and interfaces. And that's wonderful. That's a wonderful thing for the human experience, to get close with nature, get in touch with nature, experience what's going on around them by taking this pause. As well as, of course, we've seen that seismic noise, within the Earth itself actually decreased, some places by half, some places by less than that, but certainly vibrations from construction, from other activities, heavy machinery, etc., significantly decreased across the planet. And again, for varying effects. Also, in addition, pollution and contamination. Global carbon dioxide levels declined 17% in some areas, and corresponding other pollutants as well, because we're not just talking about carbon dioxide, but sulfur dioxide and other ones as well. In Canada, pollution levels in our 5 largest cities also dropped significantly. So again, we were able to appreciate the fact that, this change of pace, this anthropause, potentially could reconnect or have some effect on us that could be beneficial in the short term. So one of the things that we came out of this anthropause, and we're still mostly in it, but the light is coming at the end of the tunnel. But the one thing we should take away from this experience, this shared experience that we have, is one, how rare those collective experiences actually are. It's very rare that humans around the world can share in the same experience at the same time, positive or negative. But also that humans have a tremendous impact on the earth, from seismic activity even all the way through to wildlife sightings. Humans do have a tremendous impact. And it only didn't take very long for social media to catch on to the fact that humans were really hungry for those stories. I mean, we saw social media stories about, cleaner water, bringing back certain species. Some of them turned out to be false, of course, as these things do. But people were really interested in that, seeing how if we remove the human effect, what does nature do in replacement of that? Now, what we've seen, though, across the planet is even though we had the shared experience, and even though it's more clear than ever, the impact that we have on this planet, we know that within almost moments that those, restrictions were lifted and life could resume in certain places, that life did resume in the same way it did before. And so the lessons learned here are something that we do really need to take to heart. Those of us here at the School of Environmental and Natural Resource Sciences, we being stewards of these disciplines, really need to take that upon ourselves to be advocates for ways that we need to live more sustainably and in tune with our natural world. So my question for all of us is really, can we do better than normalcy? Do we need to go back to the normal that was, or can we actually do something a little bit different? And I know that there's much talk out there about post-pandemic resets and economies and standards of living and relationships between members of society, for sure. But at the end of the day, nature is what we have, and we use nature in so many different ways, it's impossible really to enumerate them. But without nature, of course, we wouldn't have the air we breathe, we wouldn't have the clean water that we enjoy to anywhere near the same degree. And so we have to value that. And the way that we do value that, of course, is still to be told. The story is still ongoing. We don't know how it ends yet. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to use a case study to illustrate some of this. And this is a paper that was published, as you can see, in early 2020. And it's an interesting one because it's called, of course, Conserving Africa's Wildlife and Wildlands Through COVID-19 Crisis and Beyond. And it really delves into, and again, if you're interested in reading it, I encourage you to do so, really talks about how COVID-19 and the impact globally, regionally, and locally affected essentially conservation processes within Africa and essentially the wildlands that are being managed there. And it is a really fascinating insight into many of the dynamics that we're not experiencing here in Canada, but it's important that we understand that from a global context. So the point of this paper and the point of this case study was to illustrate that because of the crisis, the global crisis that is currently still unfolding, there was a perfect storm created in the sense that there was reduced funding, in the sense that there was reduced donations, there was reduced foreign aid, there was also restrictions on operations, there was reduced tourism, there was also, unfortunately, a reduction in safeguarding of wild preserves, so rangers and ranger activity, for example, increased levels of poaching, which all culminated in a perfect storm that really set conservation efforts back tremendously. So when we think about Africa as a continent, of course, we know it's incredibly biodiverse. There's over 2,000 key biodiversity areas within the continent, and it supports one of the world's most diverse, especially large mammal population. When we think about, of course, Africa, typically we're thinking of species like elephants and giraffes and lions, etc., which, of course, we know are preserved in large-scale reserve, either state-managed or privately managed across the continent. And for the continent of Africa, and for protected areas in particular, wildlife-based tourism is an enormous source of revenue. It generates over $29 billion annually and employs about 3.6 million people directly. And that's not even the indirect benefits of those that are, of course, supporting that industry. Trophy hunting in particular, even a subset of the tourism industry, generates around $217 million over 1 million square protected kilometers. So it's really an important aspect. And the funding, of course, that's derived from wildlife tourism goes back to essentially advocate for state wildlife authorities to maintain and in fact increase conservation protected areas because of course it's a revenue generator. Contributes to food security, strengthens local economies, and of course helps to contribute to fight against poverty. Tourism generates about 40% more full-time jobs per unit investment than, say, agriculture does, twice the job power creation of an automotive, telecommunications, or financial industries, and of course receives direct foreign benefit as well, so foreign aid donations, for example. So tourism really helps governments within the continent to justify protecting and expanding wildlife habitat, all of which, of course, are good things because, of course, it's a win-win-win for everybody. It's a win for the animals, it's a win for the local economies, it's a win for the state economies, and, of course, it's a win for the tourists who get to enjoy that. So it's a really important dynamic. But when COVID-19 was first, of course, declared a global pandemic, that significantly affected operations, not only, of course, on a global context, but specifically within Africa's tourism industry. So plummeting tourism, of course, as a result of things like cancellation of air travel, travel restrictions in general, that directly impacted the amount of tourists, of course, that were entering the protected areas and contributing to the local economy, certainly increased rural poverty, of course. Budget restrictions at the same time because of the loss of revenue from tourism also drove a series of reductions in staffing, which led to poaching, tree cutting, artisanal mining, protected area encroachment, and a whole cascade of other effects, all directly, right, at some point related back to a pandemic, which of course had global implications as well. So when we're thinking of the species that are living in these protected areas, many of which were very close or already at tipping points, this crisis, unfortunately, and studies are still ongoing, of course, really pushed and really stressed that dynamic to the point where in some species, it's been shown that there may not be a recovery that's even statistically probable at this point. And again, there's variations, and we'll see some of that variation in a minute. But it's interesting to think about when we think about conservation, we think about the efforts that we take, you know, even in our local communities and our province and our country of Canada, we have to realize that the implications are quite different globally. And we have to keep that context. We really have to appreciate that perspective. This infographic here in the slide is a really interesting one from the paper. And of course, it really sort of ties into how really the pandemic had a trickle-down effect from everything from global tourism all the way down essentially to rural economy within African communities. So again, it's something we need to consider. We need to consider when we're thinking of conservation efforts after the pandemic. How can we consider future pandemics as being something that we protect against when we think about conservation efforts globally? Now, it wasn't necessarily all bad, though. We have to think about the fact that, yes, for sure, within the African continent, there was major impact on wildlife and protected areas, but there were also some potential, maybe temporary benefits as well, in the sense that some countries like China and Vietnam took steps to restrict the wildlife trade. And if that continues, which again, it's still an ongoing discussion for sure, if that continues long term, right, and the supply or the demand is changed for wildlife product, it could lead to a major change in pace for conservation efforts in Africa. Gabon, for example, banned the consumption of bats internally, as well as pangolins as well, following the crisis. So again, this is for sure something that we do need to consider, that there were some, hopefully not temporary, but certainly some temporary benefits from the crisis as well. And when we look even closer down, this is from a different paper now, this is published just last month, but when we look specifically at species, we can see that there were varying effects within areas around the world. So for example, apes, which are typically, in many cases, because their forested environment is so small and so fragmented, are sometimes given supplementary food sources. Well, when humans weren't providing the supplementary food sources or, managing the forest in a particular way because of financial cutbacks or budgetary restrictions, well, they actually ended up going without food and suffered shortage of food and actually a population decline. Whereas some beluga whales, because of changes essentially in fishing operations, actually saw a population expansion, as did buffalo, right, in Thailand, and elephants, which were reprieved from being hunted, from trophy hunting, and so again saw some expansion as well. So again, it's a bit of a mixed bag in terms of the direct effect on individual species, but for sure we can look at it from a larger context, and certainly it was not a positive one. So again, we have to take those lessons learned and apply them as best we can to our own dynamic. There are reasons, of course, to be helpful, as there always are. We do know that currently there's a lot of focus on human health and the economy, and then, of course, that being critical to a long-term perspective being vital. But safeguarding our wildlife habitats against encroachment is one of the key causes, of course, of preventing, essentially, zoonotic diseases from emerging and lessening future pandemic risks. So again, the more wildlife human interactions we have, the more likely we are to have zoonotic diseases. So again, conservation is not just good science, it really is good preventative medicine as well. So again, reasons to be hopeful, reasons to argue for the future. Now, I started off this talk by talking about our challenges pre-COVID. So, we had 8 large challenges to experience as a species: human population growth, habitat loss, emerging zoonotic diseases, biodiversity loss, climate change, pollution, introduced species, and polarization. We had those before COVID-19, and we certainly will have those after. But now our context is a little bit changed in the sense that many of these things are not just global issues. They're not just regional issues. They're actually things that we can address here in our own backyards, in our own communities, and even in our own, public areas, our public spaces. Because our social conscience really has been redefined by this shared experience. We know our limits. We know what can happen. We know what should happen now. And so again, we can learn from that. So whenever we're thinking or reflecting on an extreme example, like I just presented to you about Africa and the conservation challenges that are currently being experienced there, we need to learn from that, and we need to embrace what we can do here, because we can do many of these things. The ones I've highlighted in bold are things we can actually do right now. We can all take steps to protect our own local wildlife. And the ones that I've italicized, we certainly can make decisions that contribute to helping those things. Those are larger issues as well, but we can certainly do our part. So all of these 8 can absolutely directly or indirectly contribute to. So now the focus of our talk today is shifting from the problems that were to what we can do, because that's really the action item. You folks as students and centers at Frost, you guys are those environmental advocates. You guys know about the theory. You can take that out to your communities, to your family and your friends. You can speak about these things. So again, we challenge you to do that, because that really is the essence of being a Frost student. So let's talk. What are some of the things we can do? Like some specific things that we can do. Well, biodiversity loss. That's pretty a broad term, but of course it just applies to virtually anything, because biodiversity is different levels. Yes, we think about biodiversity loss as being species specific. So, we cut down rainforests and we lose critical species that are endangered, and once they're lost, they're gone. But remember, biodiversity is broader than that. It's not just about species. It's actually about genes and alleles within a population, genetic diversity, as much as species diversity. So when individuals are removed from the population through non-natural means, like, for example, human intervention, one way or the other, we have removed the future breeding opportunities for that individual, and we don't know how that could affect the population down the road. Maybe there was a key mutation, a key allele that population really needed, but now it's removed, and we unfortunately are directly responsible for that. So window stripes are an example of that, because in many birds, of course, their ability to see is significantly better than us as mammals. And that sounds a bit ironic because, of course, we think about birds, if they had better vision, why can't they see things like glass? But it's because they can see better than us, that they don't perceive the glass the same way we do. So one of the things about being a mammal is our vision as mammals is so-so. I mean, there's variation in there. Dogs, for example, only have 2 cone receptors on our retina to perceive differences in light. So again, dogs, we know, are fairly colorblind. They really perceive, of course, changes in light and very, very, very minor color differential. Humans and primates are a bit better. We have 3 cones, so we can see red, blue, green combinations in there, a color spectrum that is relatively restricted in comparison to the animal kingdom, but it's better than most mammals. Birds, however, have a tremendously enhanced vision than we do. They not only have more cones, they have 4 cones, they can see in UV, and they have special oil pigments on those cones that allows the oil refraction off the light, and they can see different shades and pigments of color that we can't even think of what they would look like because they're so different. Because they can see so fantastically well, they can see right through the glass. They can see right through it, they can see into your house, they can see the house plants that are there, which is why, unfortunately, many birds hit windows. So when we think about biodiversity loss, we can think about things that we can do even to our own windows. To our own windows, even at our school, for example, which is a great project, that we can do to protect against that. Because again, one individual can mean a tremendous difference, especially if that individual is a top predator, for example. So in this picture, I'm the senior wildlife biologist at Kawartha Wildlife Center. I was responsible for starting that organization, which is a wildlife rehabilitation clinic. Here I have a juvenile Cooper's hawk, which hit a window at the hospital, and of course was found on a balcony by someone who cared and obviously brought it to us, and we assessed it, treated it, and then of course, eventually we're able to release it. Now that's a good news story, and that's great. Cooper's hawks, if you've ever experienced them, they're not the most pleasant patients, but either way, it was a great news story. Got out, flew away. All of his family was waiting for him actually when he got released, and they all flew around together, and it was wonderful. It was great. But it shouldn't have happened, right? We know that windows are hazards for birds. And that Cooper's hawk, which represented, a fairly substantial portion of likely the Cooper's hawk population in that part of Peterborough, that loss of that individual could have been significant. So we need to think about ways we can protect against that. Buying particular products that have the 2-inch, decals apart, not the hawk decals that we used to think were good. Those have been shown to be not effective. Really, there are scientifically proven techniques to treat windows, and they work. And again, preventing biodiversity loss from window strikes is something we could do. Same with baby birds. We get a lot of calls at the Wildlife Center around, oh, we found this baby bird in the ground, it's probably injured. Well, so many times it depends on why that bird or what stage of life it is on the ground. If it's a hatchling, which means it has no feathers at all, or a nestling, which has some feathers, but not all, well, yes, they may need some help. They shouldn't be out of the nest, and they may need to be reunited with their parent. But so many birds, of course, are fledglings. They're fully feathered, they're on the ground, it's part of a normal life history for them. So when you take them and put them in a box thinking they're injured, of course, you are kidnapping that animal. We have to think about ways we can avoid doing that. So what are the habitat pieces that go into that? Well, we know things like birdhouses, and again, there are pros and cons of doing that, but in some urban areas, birdhouses have been shown to be such a key habitat stability mechanism for cavity nesting birds. It's always better to, of course, have wild snags and things that cavity nesters can go in, but at this point, because we're so human, centered in our way of living, that's not always a reality. So we know that there are things we can do. And being aware, as you folks at Frost would be, about wildlife, about different kinds of habitat stressors, is a good way to avoid situations like this, where we're inadvertently trying to help a situation, but we're actually causing some damage one way or the other. And of course, rehoming birds can work in many cases. These hanging baskets, these planters that if you have someone who puts a hanging basket up and waters it all summer and then tosses it at the end of the year, Well, these plastic things are wonderful. You can hang them on the tree, you can put the nestling in there, and even though the nest may be destroyed, usually the parents will find it again and of course respond to the calls and then start feeding. So it's wonderful. We see it with owls, we can do it with all kinds of things. So habitat dynamics is not always just about planting trees and creating wildlife habitat, although as we'll see in a minute, that is absolutely critical. We can also take creative human solutions to deal with habitat related issues as well. Now, a big one, of course, keeping in the biodiversity theme and pollution and contamination, is around littering. Everybody knows from the time we were in kindergarten, nobody should be a litter bug. Litter is wrong. Putting plastic on the ground is wrong. We do know that, and yet it's surprising how much litter we do see even around our own campus at Frost. We do still see litter. But one of the things that's really come into the forefront recently is the impacts of organic waste. So I don't know if this has been you, and again, it has been me. So I will fess up to this. So I'll take the heat on this. I used to, think, oh well, it's a banana peel. It's an apple core. Toss it in the ditch outside the car. It'll break down. That's what we tell ourselves. It'll break down. Well, one thing I want you to take away from it, there's one thing from this talk that you might appreciate, is the fact that organic waste, especially things that are fruit-based, so, and bananas, apples, but there's pears, you name it, they're really sugary. And so for most of the year, so we're talking from late August through till essentially June in Canada, sugar is really hard to come by for many rodents. Most rodents are not, some rodents of course hibernate, but most rodents do not. So when they come across sugar, when they know to find sources of sugary food during the winter months, it's a bonanza. This is the place to be. So when we toss our organic waste into the ditch, what it does do is it serves as a really powerful attractant for rodents. And then when we serve as a powerful attractant for rodents, we unfortunately are bringing the rodents' predators there, which in essence are usually owls. So just this year, so from January until the end of March, Kawartha Wildlife Center had 24 injured or killed owls as a result of car strikes, because they're in the ditch eating the mice. And then we drive by with the car, the owl gets frightened by the lights and the sound, and unfortunately their instinct is to rush right into the car because of the lights, and then there's a collision, which usually doesn't end well. For the owl, I should say, and sometimes for the windshield as well of the car. So it's not good for anybody. So when we think about waste, when we think about pollution and contamination, we have to realize that most of the human actions we take, bananas are not from here, and certainly if we're eating apples in the middle of February, that's still not a natural product for Canadian winter. We want to think about the impact of that, and again, try and correct it as best we can. This is a great news story. This was an owl, one of the 24. This is, of course, a barn owl. And you can see here, he came to us and he had a broken mandible. So his entire mandible was completely broken. It was broken in two. So this owl was fortunate. I mean, someone stopped, picked up the owl, brought it to us right away. And then we, of course, anesthetized it using our partners at Peterborough West. And here I am putting a splint on this animal's beak to stabilize the break. And owl bones, as well as bird bones, being remarkably quick to heal. Of course, we had some good attention between the two broken bones, and then we had a full recovery. But the owl still took 43 days in our care in order to fully heal. So it missed its breeding season this year, which is unfortunate, right? And that could have been avoided because, again, we knew exactly what had happened. Unfortunately, there was rodents in the ditch, there was apples in the ditch as well, and that happened. So again, we just want to think about that. Our human actions, unfortunately, do cause, unintentional consequences for wildlife. And again, if you can think twice about throwing away that apple core, I know it might not be gross. It may be gross to have it in your car, and maybe it's turning brown on you, and maybe it's a bit mushy. But again, just if we can think more about the biodiversity in the larger scale, that's always good. Composting is wonderful. Though. Bring it home and put it in the composter. Introduced species. Well, we don't have to go far to think about introduced species, and I mean we can name them everything from plants to animals to mollusks to everything. I mean Canada and the Americas for sure, receives more than its fair share of introduced species from Eurasia. And so again, many of those species have come. But of course, the one we talk about extensively around wildlife is cats. Because cats, of course, are introduced to North America. They're not native to here. And they were introduced for a variety of reasons. Of course, they're important for, having a companion animal, but also, of course, at a farm for serving as rodent control. So there was, of course, rationale to bring them at the time. But we know now the impact that those animals do have indirectly and inadvertently on wildlife. Because cats are not native to North America, none of North America's species of mammals or birds have immunity or resistance against a particular bacteria that is found in cat saliva and cat claws. So cat scratch fever is actually a zoonotic disease. It can affect humans. In fact, many humans do die, not many I should say, but humans do die of cat scratch fever, and many humans actually do get a cat scratch and then do have a reaction to that. Usually not lethal, but for wild animals, for example, birds or small mammals, even one small perforation of the skin, a small scratch of the skin, and contact between the saliva or the claws and the animal's body fluids will have a 98% chance of sepsis to develop. So even though the cat may be just playing with the bird and the bird flies away and we think everything's fine, if the cat did manage to scratch the animal, that bird is almost guaranteed to die, unfortunately. And that is, again, the cat doesn't know any different. It's certainly not intentional necessarily, but it's still the reality. So Environment Canada predicts that through climate change, habitat loss, varying other effects, 130 to 433 million birds die a year. But cats are attributed to about 75% of those deaths, both feral and domestic. So think about the number of birds that die per year from cats. It's astronomical, really. And again, it's one of those things we encourage. This is, we know cats want to be outside, and no one's saying not to. Maybe we consider building a little catio, an area, a space where they can go outside. It's screened. They can watch. Bird feeder can be right beside it. We'll talk about bird feeders in a minute. And they can watch it and they can enjoy that. But they're safe from wild animals, which can carry diseases to them. But they're also, safe from interacting with the wild animals in reverse. So again, we just want to think about that. Think about the dynamics and ways we can contribute to a solution and contribute to an improvement in conservation efforts. Habitat loss is a big one. As mentioned before, it would be great if we could leave cavities, snags and dead trees for cavity nesters, but that's not a safe decision in many cases in a human enriched environment. So we need to think about other ways. And gardening for wildlife is one of them. Planting native plants has become very much on point in recent years. If we have an option to choose something that's native versus non-native, we'll choose the native one. Chances are it's probably going to do even better in Canadian climate than the non-native one. But it will also enrich our local wildlife populations as well, which contributes inadvertently to a reversal of biodiversity loss. So again, it's remarkable how many species of organisms you can get in a small garden space, even on a balcony. It's tremendous, the diversity that can do. And if everybody did a little bit, it's amazing what you could get at the end of it. This is a snapshot of an overview of a subdivision from our local community. And if you look at it from the sky, you can see that we have this fabulous wetland up here. Great. It's got lovely borders. Yes, there's some houses here, but there's lovely buffers here, which is great. We've got trees. This, of course, will be teeming with wildlife, frogs, you name it, herons, etc. Lovely. But look at all the backyards. There's barely a garden. There's barely even a tree. Right? They're tiny. This is a snapshot, a bird's eye view of how we as a species live our existence. And it doesn't really take much. A couple of fruiting shrubs will be overwintering food for birds. A couple of, pollinating plants would be great for insects throughout the summer. It doesn't take a whole lot. Everybody just did a little bit. We would have a tremendous increase in our biodiversity and habitat loss prevention. And then bird feeders. Well, bird feeders have grown in popularity since the Great Anthropause. Everybody and everyone wanted to feed the birds, especially over this winter, because of course it was something that we could feel connected with nature. We could feel that we're contributing to something bigger than ourselves, which is very important from a human perspective. But feeding the birds, of course, we know comes with a responsibility. You know that if you start feeding birds, it's certainly recommended that you don't stop, because again, they may be reliant on that food source. But we also don't think of the fact that we have to clean it every week or immediately after there's a visibly sick bird that's at the feeding station, because the reality is that birds are highly mobile. They can move from place to place, plus they have these terrific migrations which cover the entire continent plus, and they bring diseases everywhere, right? And of course, a migrating bird, if they're infected carriers, they will deposit in one area and then keep going. They'll be fine. But everybody else who's a resident at that feeder may get sick. Past year alone, our increases are on conjunctiva, right? Conjunctiva's diseases have increased by something like 130%, our patients just at Korth Wildlife Center. Because we know that, of course, unfortunately, many people are not cleaning their bird feeders and being responsible with them. So again, it's an example of we as humans really wanting to help and contribute to something, but our actions inadvertently having actually the opposite intention of what we want. So again, being diligent about thinking about those are important. Considering what our bird feeders are made of, again, is very important. Things like plastic, steel, or glass. Again, we try and avoid plastics, but they're cleanable, right? They're non-porous. Things that are wood-based or clay, we can't clean them. You cannot bleach them. The bacteria and the fungi spores will still be in there, and they will reinfect those species. We want to have small feeders, but many of them potentially, as opposed to a big feeder with many feeding stations, because we, again, social distance for us works to prevent zoonotic diseases and infectious diseases from spreading. We have to think about the same thing for our birds. So we want to have bird feeding stations that may only have 1 or 2 feeding ports, but maybe you have 6 of them instead of 1 that has 12, right? I know that's more work for us, and yes, as some of us don't want the work, we get that, but it's better because, again, you're reducing competition, you're keeping more individuals separate, and you're reducing the likelihood of spreading diseases, all of which are important considerations. We want to avoid things like tray feeders because, of course, the birds will defecate right on their food. That's not a good thing. We want to avoid hopper feeders because, unfortunately, because they're open from the bottom but not ventilated at the top, they allow mildew and mold to grow, and especially avian tuberculosis and aspergillosis to proliferate. Window feeders we don't recommend because of window strikes, and we've already talked about windows. So yes, it's great that they're close to us, but the bird-eating predators, like the sharp-shinned hawks, for example, unfortunately, they're the ones who usually get hit by the window strike. So again, we try and avoid them if we can. Niger feeders, they work great because they're like socks and they can be washed in the washing machine once a week. Well, hopefully like our socks, or maybe more often, depends. But again, the same idea applies. Tube feeders are good, typically, especially if the feeding ports are, you can see here, they're offset. So the bird above is not pooping on the bird below. And the food, you can see here, the food level stops because there's a break here at the bottom of the first feeding station, meaning that a bird could eat the feed all the way down to the bottom and clean it out, not allowing food to sit there and then mold and then be difficult to clean. This is what we try to avoid. We don't want this because this, unfortunately, is a disease magnet. It's not socially distanced. You can see how many birds are here. You can see that it's a great big long tube. It's almost impossible to clean this. I don't know what you'd use to clean it. Maybe a broom, I don't know, with something on it. But if you look at the feeding station, this is the top of the bottom of the first feeding station, but like there's all this food here that no bird can ever get to because there's no hole there for it. And all that's going to do is rot and mold and then proliferate disease agents. So we need to avoid that. So biodiversity loss. Many of the things we can do, of course, comes at an individual level. So for many of our predator species, there are a few of them, so every one of them is important. And sometimes that means that we have to take action. If we see an injured or orphan or diseased animal, sometimes, of course, that means bringing it to a center, a wildlife authorized custodian who can be able to manage that animal, and then, of course, in essence of releasing it and allowing those genes to propagate to the next generation. It's really important if we're ever in contact or we experience an injured, diseased, or orphaned wild animal, we never touch it with our bare hands. We're always wearing some sort of gloves or hand protection, not only for your safety from physical injury, but also from disease agents and vice versa, right? So again, bird feathers are very sensitive to human oils, so we need to prevent that as much as we can. If we ever do come across an animal that needs some help, Prepare a container, make sure it's opaque, ideally, with ventilated holes at the top. Put the animal in it. Don't offer it anything to eat or drink. Animals in shock, if you feed them or give them water, they may actually drown, first of all, inside or aspirate. Or if you give them food and they're in shock, they're going to be unable to process that and actually may end up vomiting or actually becoming impacted in their gut or their crop or their ventriculus. So we need to avoid that. We need to secure the container because animals are very good at escaping, and then record the exact GPS coordinates where you found it. Because there are rules that the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry says that you can only release the animal within 5 kilometers of where it was from. So again, if you don't know where it was from, by law, you can't release it. So again, it's really important that you take an exact coordinate. And again, being at Frost, we do know about GPS, we do know about the environmental dynamics of that, so this comes in handy for that. And of course, wash our hands thoroughly and then contact an authorized custodian. So that, of course, brings us to our final, but probably most important human-related challenge that we have. Yes, biodiversity loss, climate change, they're all so important. There's certainly nothing to take away from that. But we can't really get a whole lot of traction, and we can't necessarily move ahead the way we need to if we're so polarized and we have an inability, of course, to listen. And that is something, of course, we can all take steps to improve. It's something that we can all, share freely with, folks that have other opinions than us. But at the end of the day, we have confidence in the scientific community in the sense of the work that's being done and the research that's underway. But it's the ability to share that information in a way that not only allows people to feel maybe comfortable, maybe that's not the right word, but to feel part of it, have part of that collective experience, part of that collective action, because we can't do this alone. Individuals certainly can make efforts. We can all do our bit, but it's a whole lot of individuals working towards a common goal that we really see the rubber hit the road in terms of true action. So how we get there, of course, we have to work with our own species. We have to work within the dynamics of our own human experience in order to help others. So again, we can do one thing again. Yes, we talked about bird feeders, and yes, we talked about organic waste, but again, the need to listen to other humans, of course, even in an age of virtual listening is absolutely incredibly important. Well, I've talked for quite some time now, 50 minutes, so I'm sure you're probably finished hearing what I have to say, but I hope that you at least enjoyed, or maybe you picked something up that you hadn't thought of before from the talk. I'm happy, of course, at any time to discuss more about conservation biology and sort of not only the science behind it, but the dynamics behind it and the context that we have now living through a life-changing experience of a pandemic. So I'll open it up to any questions. If there's any questions, thoughts, comments, now would be the time.
So there is a couple questions in chat. So I'll read out one from Xander Campbell. How effective would a feral cat call be? Would this ever be able to happen in Canada? And could this not help native species over a period of time?
That's a really good question. And again, it's a great one because it's a politically charged question that, to be honest, Xander, we as humans in Canada have been wrestling with for hundreds of years, because previously we have done calls. We have done feral colony calls. We've removed whole colonies, and yes, there have been temporary benefits of that in the sense that there's been, of course, fewer cats, fewer injuries between cats, because it's not just cats against wildlife, it's, of course, cats against cats, and that life for a cat is also very hard as well. They're very territorial, and there's a lot of infighting. So when we have those calls, they are politically charged because there is a whole lot of opinions, one, on the efficacy of them, but two, again, people look at cats, feral cats, the same way they would their pets, in the sense that this is an animal that someone is killing needlessly. So again, it's a very difficult thing to answer. Do calls work? Yes, they do. Are calls always practicable? No, they're not. Because again, there are differing levels of willingness by municipal governments to undertake that. And again, part of that is the public experience side of it. As of now, most organizations have moved to a trap, neuter, and release model. The idea being that if you have a cat that is neutered, and say it's a male cat with a territory, and it is, say, breeding with females, but obviously not actually passing on any genetic material, but it's maintaining a territory, that it will over time reduce the number of cats because there is a territory there that other cats won't move into. So there is some studies that show that that has some effect as well, and there is some areas where in fact that has good effect. Whether or not we see that being a long-term solution, I'm not sure. Will we ever go back to feral cat calls? Probably not. So again, I think that is a good example of something where we know there is a major problem with cats. We know that feral cats are something that really it's a difficult problem. So most of the effort now is on domestic cat management, people's pets. Because believe it or not, there is not that much difference between the number of wildlife that are killed by feral cats proportionally to people's pet cats. In fact, there's not that much of a difference at all if you look at the numbers. Pet cats actually kill just about 25% less wildlife than all the feral cats do. So that's where a lot of the emphasis is, because there's a perceived benefit for the pet owners to keep their cats safe as well.
Cool. Thank you. I'll just say if anyone has any other questions now, please put them in the chat. Adam, do you have any questions you'd like to ask?
Yeah, I have a question. Is my mic working?
Yep.
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah, so what I'm curious about is, with COVID and the increase in wildlife sightings and into urban areas and everything, how has that affected your work at the Kawartha Wildlife Center? Like, have you seen a statistically significant increase or decrease in animals coming in because of, because of less people on the roads, more animals coming, but yeah, so stuff like that. Have you seen any changes or changes in injury types or anything like that?
Absolutely, Adam, that's a great question. Thank you for asking that. Last year we thought, wow, this is going to be a great year for us because you know what? Nobody's driving, nobody's on the roads, no road strikes. This will be a great spring and it'll allow a lot of the populations to rebound. But if you do recall, this time last year, we didn't have 14 degrees. We are having a major snowstorm, which unfortunately reset all of the birds and small mammals who had started their first clutch were abandoned. So unfortunately, instead of having, 2 or even 3 clutches, birds usually had 2, maybe 1 even. So everything got reset. So last year was a hard year for us. This year, we're seeing about 60% more patients today than we were last year. Part of that is probably because there's greater awareness of wildlife and people are being more vigilant in many cases. And also I think people have had the time to do a lot of research on what to do if you find an injured wildlife. A lot of times I think people would just see something on the side of the road and just keep driving. Whereas now I think people are actually more empathetic and are willing to stop and bring it to us. So part of that I think is just a human dynamic, and people are more aware of the service and aware of the organization itself. But a lot of it really is around more people are also doing, how should I put this, improvement projects to their houses. So they're in their attics, they were up doing stuff, which was disturbing wildlife as well. So I think that's part of it. But I think, and I'd like to hope, that it's actually because more people are empathetic to suffering wildlife, and that's why we're seeing such a significant increase over last year.
That's 60%. That's definitely really major. So you talked a bunch about, what individuals can do, changing out bird feeders or having better bird feeders or not throwing out apple cores or banana peels and stuff like that. What can, like if a group of students wanted to get together, like what's a significant thing that they could do if they wanted to make a difference?
Well, I think one of the best things we can do as a student government and students within is, of course, protect birds by protecting our windows. So again, I think that would be a fantastic opportunity. And again, I'd love for the student government to continue with that initiative. I think it would be a fantastic solution. I think again, too, the college that we have here is well positioned in the sense that we are asking students to separate green waste. Now, again, I think there's more work to be done there. But I think, again, for students to be aware that, litter of any kind is a bad thing. And the easiest thing we can do in the world, of course, is pick it up. And we do have facilities, and I know that they do their best, but facilities in particular now is stretched with a lot of the health and safety measures that have been in place since the pandemic, and a lot of potentially the litter collection that has happened on campus, and we have public trails going through the campus property. That's certainly been a challenge. So I think for groups of students, even to do litter collection, also things like cavity enrichment. So if we did really want to embrace, you know, a bird box building program, that we could manage them properly and clean them and do all the things that we need to do with them and put them up in areas where we truly need them, in the sense that they're appropriately placed. I think those would be fantastic opportunities, not only for wildlife, but also for learning experiences as well, and not just for one species of birds, but for other species of birds as well. I'm sure there's other things, Adam. I'm sure we could talk about it for a long time. That's just all I can think off the top of my head, but.
Perfect. Yep. A couple questions here in the chat. Xander asked, is there a bird banding program at the college?
No, I don't believe so. There is in the Fish and Wildlife program, they do teach bird banding as a part of the curriculum, with pigeons, I believe. But actual bird banding, you would go through essentially through a master bander who is, there's a bird banding program within Ontario and within Canada through the Canadian Wildlife Service. So there is a whole separate process for that. That's not, it's taught in the Fish and Wildlife program as a standalone curriculum outcome, but the actual bird banding process is delivered elsewhere.
Okay, and we got one more from Alexandra. Speaking of increasing biodiversity, is it necessary for the college to have so much seemingly unused lawn space on campus? Wouldn't it be better to use that space for native plants that would aid pollinators?
What a fantastic idea. And again, I think that is a perfect, again, I didn't even think of that, but you're right. I mean, when we mow the grass, yes, there's some health and safety management in the sense that, you know, we do know that long grass could have ticks, and yes, you could have those arguments there, but as you say, there's a lot of grass on campus, and having pockets of meadow area where we know people aren't going to be walking anyway, not only saves fuel in the term of you've got to maintain the grass, but it also, of course, allows pollinators and other small animals to live there. So I think what a fantastic initiative to petition the school to really invest that and do it properly. Historically, there was an initiative probably about 10 years ago where they had said, well, you know what, we're not going to cut the grass this year. But not cutting the grass everywhere is not the same as being strategic in allowing native plants to grow in areas where they can thrive. So again, I think there are ways to do it well, and I think that would be a fantastic advocacy piece for students to do for the college.
Perfect. Well, it doesn't look like we have any other questions. So I just wanted to thank you very much for joining us today, Thom. This has been really interesting. Yeah, is there anything you'd like to plug?
No, I think I'm good. I just want to applaud the student government here, the Frost student government, for their tireless dedication to conservation initiatives like protecting against windows, again, ideas of you know, native plants. I think that this is a campus that can really set not only the leadership within colleges within Ontario, but really make a difference, not only for our students' lives, but also for our local biodiverse community. So I think this is the place to try these things. And I think you guys as students are best positioned to advocate the school to make it happen.
Thank you very much, Thom.
Well, thanks everybody for joining, and it was my pleasure. Have a good evening.
Take care.
There's one more quick question right before we end. Lauren asked, a mallard has made a nest in her neighborhood just in a stormwater pond. Is there anything that she can do safely to not disturb it too much and to make sure neighborhood dogs or people are not going to disturb her in her nest?
Oh, I see. So mallards, mallards nest in the most interesting of places. Let's put it that way. So yes, we do. This is about the time of year where we get lots of calls around. There's a duck nesting like literally in my front door. What do I do? And simple answer is, you know, yes, they have relatively long incubation periods, but those birds are born precocial, and the moment they hatch, they're going to be gone in the stormwater pond. They'll float around there for a couple of weeks, and then off they will go. So the best thing you can do in that case is really to put up a series of homemade signs, especially near any local trails where people, especially like before people would ever be tempted to release a dog, say off leash, which I know we're not supposed to do, but people still do. You can put a sign right at the sidewalk or the entrance to that area, you know, saying, you know, there is a nesting duck here, please be aware. People are quite empathetic for the most part, and people will respect that, especially if it's a homemade sign, something that they know that someone else has spent a lot of time and effort to make. That's really effective and very effective for people. And then putting the sign, of course, closer to the nest itself to reiterate that, you know, please make sure you have your dog on a leash. Please avoid, you know, this area. There's a nesting duck. And then also taking them down though, because the thing we do is we sometimes put up signs and then the signs lose their impact because they stay up. So when we put up a couple of signs, we do want to take them down as quickly as, of course, they're not needed, because people, they lose their effectiveness over time, right? If we just keep them up. So that would be my recommendation there.
That's awesome. Thank you, Thom. And one last plug. As we talked about today, the FSA is currently circulating and working on a proposal to get bird-friendly Fleming, where we're going to be working with the college to try to get bird-friendly dots on all of the windows and glass in and around all the Fleming campuses. So keep an eye on your email and sign that if that is something that is important to you. Thank you again to Thom and everybody that came out today.